So you started your own podcast. So if you could have any three guests on your show, who would you choose?
Do they have to be in my niche?
No, it could be anyone, like anyone you want to speak to, anyone you find interesting, dead or alive.
Okay. Or one person that comes to mind, I'd love to have Gilbert Anoka on, which was the mental performance coach for the All Blacks.
Mm-hmm.
He'd be really cool. Dan Carter would be cool.
I've read his book and he actually mentions Gilbert in there. There's like a fair bit of section in there. So talks a lot about the mental training. So it'll be interesting.
I'll keep it in the athlete space. Yep. And also I'm already confident I'll have a conversation with Nico. So I won't use Nico for this example, but I'd love to have someone like Nathan Cleary on. Mm-hmm. I think he's got like a pretty cool depth. The only thing is I don't think that episode will probably go live because there'd probably be some secrets or stuff revealed in that, because I feel like there'd be some. He's very switched on mentally. Mm-hmm. You can see how mentally switched on. I would just love to unpack the mental thought process going through his mind in peak states of performances like that grand final against Broncos.
No, I'm a Broncos fan. Please don't. It would be interesting. Have you listened to? I haven't listened to it yet, but I saw the snippet with him and Keegan.
Yeah, I listened to it.
How was that? Did you find
it was
much
good.
Out of there?
I always knew it was going to be a great episode. I'd had Keaton on my podcast, which was great, and he shared a lot of insight. So I knew that the questions asked was going to be pretty valuable. When you're in this space and you immerse yourself in this space on a daily basis regularly, you can very pick up on and sense the mentally mature athletes. Mm-hmm. And Nathan's, I'd love to sit in his mind for a day as well. I think that'd be really cool. And I'm very blessed and grateful for some of the athletes I get to work with, and they're the same. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's just like you work with more of them. You want to work. You want to unpack more of their minds, because you just love to hear the different perspectives and thought processes. So yeah. From
an outside perspective, being with Nathan, do you think having Ivan there was like one of the key reasons to help him get so mature? Or do you think it was like a personal tick, just from an outside perspective? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. Like, I can only imagine he was in a professional setting from a very young age, with his dad being a professional footballer.
You see those photos when he's at the Warriors and he's like 7 years
of course.
Old, always been in there.
From what I've seen and heard, it just seems like Nathan very much values his foundational habits in his life. From what I've seen and heard, reading, nature, those sorts of things, journaling, I think he's into, or what I've heard. So it just seems like he just doesn't leave a stone unturned, and he treats his mental performance just as much. He treats his mental performance with just as much enthusiasm as he treats his physical performance.
Before we get into the sports psych stuff, how did you get into the industry, and how did you sort of find that this was your purpose?
Purpose is a funny word. I would say I'm very curious about this, but transparently, I don't think it's my purpose. Reason being is, and I'll explain it, I got into it because I had run a gym for 6 years, and I'm very close with Nico. He's a dear friend of mine, and we had been in conversations and having conversations, and obviously the back end of my gym career, I had started to push the mental and emotional. I'm not going to use mental health. It wasn't really mental health, but mental well-being, right? I think that's in a different sort of category. And just talking about how people can, better deal with their stresses and anxieties in life, rather than just using training as the only coping mechanism to work through something, right? Because like with anything, training can also become a Band-Aid or a bad habit. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? If it's a great outlet, don't get me wrong, but COVID showed to us without it what can happen with people's mental health. Do you know what I mean? And so I started working with Nico. We're having conversations just around certain things as he was navigating, the early years of him being in, a professional setting. And then as he moved into Cronulla, we sort of more formalized it and said, if we really want to do this, if we really want to navigate this change and do it well and, move into that next level of your career, let's really formalize this and create some structure and, start paying me, because I don't see paying as like, I need to take money from him. I see it more as a commitment. It's just it's a price. It's the price of commitment, right? Mm-hmm. Anything we pay for, we value, we hold more value to it. And so we worked with each other that year. We're very committed to our structure. We still use the same structure now. And obviously the result, was fantastic. Nico, went on to win the Dally M, and that wasn't all due to mental performance. He spends a lot of time on his craft every day, and I have nothing to do with that. But also at the same time, a lot of his rise was to do with mental performance as well, because, the way that he is mentally reflects how he performs on the field. And that's, a really good indicator with most athletes. You can get away with a couple of games not being mentally good, but over time you'll start to burn out and fade away if, your mentals isn't in a good space. And so when I come back to the whole reason why it's not my purpose because I think our purpose is more closely correlated to what we have been through directly, meaning as an individual. I haven't been through what these athletes have been through, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so I love what I do. I'm so curious about what I do. Absolutely. But I look at my purpose now, and I look at my purpose. I'm like, I got a son. I got a 15-month-old son there. And I really tried to focus on that being my purpose. And having just as much enthusiasm around that as I do my work, because, that's been a challenge, is navigating that. So, yeah, I love what I do. It's a massive curiosity of mine, and I'm so blessed to be able to do what I do. But yeah, to be honest with you, I still don't feel like I've found that purposeful work. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when you build these relationships with athletes and you can build that intimate relationship over a long enough period of time, you do start to see more behind the curtains. And I would say that's purposeful work. But the relationship with athletes needs to be built over time for them to feel comfortable enough and trust you enough to get to that purposeful work, if that makes sense. And there's probably only like 2 or 3 athletes that I've had the privilege of being able to go to that purposeful work. And I'm sure we'll probably speak on some of those points today.
So you obviously mentioned Nico, and you've worked with Callum Ponga, Tamika Upton.
Yeah.
I'm a footy nut, so I saw the footy names. Obviously, there's golfers and fighters in there. Yeah. One of the things I saw on your page was you talk about the difference between being good and being great. Yeah. Can you sort of dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. Being exposed and working with teams and working with multiple different athletes from multiple different sports around the world, the game that these athletes are playing is an edge. They're literally looking for the smallest of edges. The first decision and difference between good and great was the commitment to what being great actually looks like. I think people like the idea of being great more than they actually want to be great. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've seen, right? It's like being great, the level of sacrifice and the level of challenge you have to go through is on another level. A good athlete, they face scrutiny. A great athlete, it is on another ballpark of level. You be expected, and you said Kalen there. There was points where Kalen and Nico were the most talked about people in the NRL at one given time, and they were both clients at the time. Kalen, we have a great relationship. He's an awesome fellow, but not active with our work right now, and obviously still active with Nico. But you ever look at what Nico went through last year and the amount of attention that he got. He was probably the most scrutinised athlete in Australian sport, not just rugby league. Mm. But he dares to be great. And so the first step between being good and great is actually asking yourself, do you want to be great? And are you willing to take on everything that comes at you when you are wanting to be great? That's the first thing. The second thing is great athletes. It's so easy for good athletes to neglect and forget about the smallest of things. The great athletes don't become great in single moments. They become great in single moments behind closed doors by themselves, and you zoom out over 3 to 4 years, and that's why they're great. Nico doesn't want to turn up into a mental performance session on a Sunday afternoon when it's his day off. He doesn't always want to do that. He's sometimes really tired, and so am I. He doesn't always want to do that, but he knows what it does to him. He knows the result. He doesn't let his emotional feeling get in the way of that, and he makes a decision. So that's the second point, is they understand the importance of the smallest things daily compounding, and they don't miss them. The third thing is great athletes from a practical standpoint in a performance, it really comes down to 3 to 5 moments or 1 to 5 moments, not many moments in a performance where they back themselves. And whether you want to call it self-belief, whether you want to call it trained into them, it's an element of competency, which is, the confidence in their skill or the time that they're spent on their craft training that skill. But there's also an element of, I think, that they have become so equipped with dealing with the fear of what could go wrong if they don't execute it. And learning that they place their sense of self-worth not on what the external thinks of them, but how they view themselves. And so when they place their sense of self-worth not by the external pressure, but how they view themselves, they no longer fear going after the performance. Does that make sense? They don't have to play in their shell and perform in their shell because they know that as long as they go after it, they're satisfied and they're happy with themselves. And so then in key moments, they have a path of most optimal or suboptimal. A lot of athletes will choose the suboptimal and comfortable path and play in their shell or play okay performances, which is good. You can have a good career playing an okay performance, but you won't become great because you're just doing things you're comfortable with. And so I guess the great athlete just stands up in the key moments.
I work with a lot of young students being a teacher, and I think confidence that you mentioned there is it's such a thing that a lot of people lack, and I think you explained it well in people have confidence because they believe in themselves. Is there questions that you ask or activities that you do to help people see the confidence and help see the best in themselves?
Yeah, why don't they have confidence? I feel like as humans, it's like affirmations. I'm not a personal believer of affirmations because they only reaffirm to the mind what you're not. Meaning you don't need an affirmation to if you already are the thing. So what it proves to the subconscious mind is you're not at that thing. So if you're not wealthy and you go, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy, I'm wealthy, it's just reaffirming to the fact that you're not wealthy because you wouldn't need the affirmation in the first place. So it's like, where did you lose the confidence? And then you go to the story of where the confidence was lost because there was a time where you probably were confident and then the confidence was taken away from you. And so what was that point in time where you did have confidence and then it was taken away from you? So rather than building confidence, I was like, I think we are innately confident people and we innately have an authentic expression. I see athletes like artists, they're naturally expressing themselves on the pitch, on the field, in the arena, however they express themselves, as authentically as possible. And so I like to unpack, okay, why don't you have confidence and what are the parts of your journey that made you lose confidence? Unpack them and look at, the coping mechanisms they built around that, and then we can unravel the story and we can look to build confidence. But from a practical standpoint, confidence is built through their preparation. Every athlete will say that. They get confidence through their preparation. One thing that I think can impact confidence is overcomplicating. Mm-hmm. Simplicity is clarity, clarity is confidence. You know what I mean? So there's multiple perspectives of building confidence, but yeah, one of them I look at is like if we create really tangible, simple focus points for your performances, that's going to give you confidence because you can see how easily achievable those 2 to 3 key points are. Rather than feeding your mind 10 points, then you become overwhelmed, then you stress, then you create anxiety, then you lose confidence, and that shows in your performance. So there's that element to it. But yeah, I always like to go, what's the story that contributed to the fact that you feel like you don't have confidence?
So it's less of, you did talk about building confidence, but it's finding where you lost it rather than trying to build on it.
Yeah. When I work with the elite athletes, we're not more so looking at how to be better. We're more so about bridging the gap between their worst and their worst performances and their best performances. And we do that by working on where they're exposed. Mm-hmm. So for example, if I work with an athlete, we sit down at the start of the year and this is a one-on-one client or any athlete I work with, we'll look at, okay, cool. where were we exposed from the previous year and how can we develop that area and lift the standard of that? And then that improves your baseline as an athlete. So then another way great athletes are great is because they perform great consistently. Mm-hmm. And so the gap between an okay and a great performance is shrunken.
What about those sessions where you have the best training session ever? It's just everything's perfect, but then you get to game sense and there's a bit of pressure and just sort of nothing starts going to plan. Is that still a confidence thing or is that something else that it might be going on?
It's multiple different factors. I guess I'll answer it based on how I think I interpret the question, but there's a difference between a training mentality and a performing mentality to a degree. Mm-hmm. You can take and absorb more information in a training zone because there's naturally not 2 points on the line. There's naturally not contracts on the line. And I'm talking to elite athletes here, not the one fighting for positions, but naturally the Nathan Clearys of the world aren't going to lose their spot in the team for a poor session. Does that make sense? So the room for flexibility and making an error and absorbing more information is heightened at training. And so it should, because that means you can stretch the gap of your capacity and do things in training that push you, and then you build up the repetition in your mind, the confidence in that, so then you can emulate it in a performance. Then when we get to performance and there's 60,000 people in the crowd and you got to win the game to make the finals, and if you don't, you're going to lose your contract. There's so many external variables and so many significant variables that add pressure, okay, or expectation or fear. Because if we don't achieve this, this is what could be the potential outcome that I don't want. And so naturally what happens is if we take the training mind into the performance mind, we're going to clutter the mind, overwhelm it with too much with the add-on of the pressure of the performance, the 2 points, the 1 point, whatever it is, the contract, the livelihood, the putting food on the table for the kids. All these stories come into place. So then what we do is we strip it back. We find, I like to call it the flow state activator, which is a process I help athletes with, which is like we focus on 2 cues. We train them to develop 2 cues in their performance that help them stay in flow state. It's simple, they're cues. It puts them into flow. It puts them into action. It puts them into simplicity. And as a byproduct of that, they're able to go about their performance really clearly.
Could you expand on like what the cues might be?
I like to use a pie chart just as an example. It's like, if you've got one pie chart and it has 10 sections in it, and then you've got another pie chart that has 2 sections in it, right? I like to focus on the 2 sections and then allow the simplicity of that to then grab out all of the information pieces as they need them. So what I mean by that is throughout the week, you're going to, depending on what sport you're in, whether you're in golf, you're going to look at the track, you're going to look at the hole, you're going to look at the greens, you're going to look at the slope. Boxer, you're going to study the opposition, study rugby league players, because we both know that space. You're going to study the opposition, you're going to study their opposing center, you're going to look at their defensive cues and their attacking cues, right? So you're absorbing a lot of information. By the time you get to the week, you've streamlined it down to like, maybe it's like 5 to 10 focus points and cues that you and the team are going to be looking out for. Now, if you can't be expected to maintain 10 pieces of information in your mind at all times, does that make sense? And nor does a performance ever go to plan. We're always needing to adapt. So the clearer the mind is with 2 focus points, the more we're able to pull out the information from the week as we need it. So meaning like the clearer your mind is, the more you're able to see things that you've trained throughout the week more clearly in the performance because you are clear in the mind. Does that make sense from the focus perspective?
Yeah.
Now, if you talked about creating a cue, often what will happen is, without giving too much away, but often what will happen is, the way I like to help athletes focus on flow is if you can think about a set of dominoes and you think about making a tackle, right? And you winning the tackle or dominating the tackle, being the 10th domino in that sequence. Before that, you've got to win the tackle, you need to win the wrestle. To win the wrestle, you need to win the contact. To win the contact, you need to have good footwork. To have good footwork, you typically need to have good line speed. To have good line speed, you need to be set early. To be set early, you need to have good retreat speed. So what I help athletes focus on is like, what are the dominoes they can focus on that they can repeat on attack and D if it's rugby league or even football, soccer, for example, I do the same thing, that you can repeat on over and over and over again because that becomes your baseline. Does that make sense? Because athletes need to change their performances each week to a degree because they're versing new oppositions. I wanted to help athletes have some certainty in their blueprints, in their focus points. And so what we do is we train cues. So yeah, like I said, figure out what domino 1 is. So for a soccer player, if you want to have a good pass, typically what it came back to for an athlete that I worked with was creating space. You know what I mean? Because that means they could get to the ball and have more time on the ball to be able to execute the pass.
So would the cue then be like creating space?
Yeah, the cue might be creating space, or the cue might be in rugby league might be retreat speed. Because if you win the retreat speed, that knocks over domino 1, and such by knocking over domino 1, you then you knock over the other dominoes. And then what that does is when they're on D, they're just thinking retreat speed, retreat speed, retreat speed, retreat speed, retreat speed. Does that make sense? And that's all they're focusing on D. They get to attack, and then they're just focusing on that cue. And when I say this, I'm not saying don't focus on the other things. What I'm saying is we're giving the mind like a box to work into a degree. Because there's so many factors that can happen and the emotions are so heightened in the performance and there's so many variables happening at any given time, the more that we don't have boundaries for the mind, the more the mind can start working against us. So the cues, not only do they give them focus and flow, they also act as like a bit of a lead, like walking the dog for the mind. You keep the mind on a lead and a leash, and it keeps it with it rather than it starting to work against you. You start to get frustrated. You open your inside shoulder. You miss tackles. You do all these certain things because you weren't in control of your mind. So these focus points also have a nuance to it, which is like it actually becomes like a mind controller, if that makes sense.
Cues are a great one. Another thing I've experienced is you're in a classroom or you're on the training field and you're trying to sort of replicate the game scenario and you're trying to teach, I guess, some mindset strategies. But when you get on the field in the heat of the moment, it's just sort of that exploding. Is there any other sort of strategies you recommend, or is the cues a good one? Or how could you sort of go around trying to replicate, I guess, the environment a little bit more when you're like, all right, we're going to practice this activity, but then you get to the game and everyone forgets it and senses are heightened. How would that go?
In a performance, I really focus on not leaving anything up to interpretation. Meaning everything that I help athletes with when we're speaking about certain things from away from the performance. So let's say I'm in a session with a client. I'm going to give them the breakdown of how it works psychologically, what's happening here, why it's happening, give them depth, give them meaning to the reasons why we do things. In a performance, we just build action-based or tangible-based focus points to deal with things. The reason being is it puts them in process straight away. If I go to an athlete, you just want to try and be present in the moment when you're heated. That's like, what does that even mean? The athlete then realizes they're not present. They become frustrated by the fact that they're not present, become even less present, more frustrated because they're not present, and then they make more mistakes. Presence doesn't provide action. So what I like to focus on is provide action-based things that athletes can do in performance that are designed around 3 things. The first thing is they need a way to overcome an error mentally. So they can bounce back and execute the next moment rather than going missing for 3, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, the rest of the performance, all because of one poor moment. So they need a way to overcome errors mentally. They need a way to gain momentum or regain momentum when they don't have momentum. So how do we gain momentum from the start of the performance or from a stoppage or whatever? How do we gain momentum and then maintain momentum before we get complacent? Or how do we gain momentum when we don't have momentum? So they need a process for that. The third thing is they need a process when they're experiencing doubt in the moment. And I call that the alter ego advantage. So we help them design an alter ego. They have a contrast between their limited self, their empowering self. They name both those versions of themselves. And by doing that, they have cues that they can use. And then that flows into the flow state activator so they have an action they can take. So everything that I try and build with athletes becomes practical in their performance, very simple, very easy, very cuey. So it triggers things. It puts them into motion rather than going, oh, just try and take a breath when you're frustrated, or like try and be present. You know what I mean? Like it just, I just haven't seen it to be effectively work when someone yells out, just try and be present when you're frustrated.
Yeah. Do you have, for the first two, do you have any examples? So you said that last one, you said the alter ego, but for like, so the first two for the error and like trying to find a cure, like, do you have any examples of like what that looks like?
Yeah, I'm gonna speak on this on a macro term, just for the respect out of clients that pay.
Yeah, perfect.
But it all stems around like getting mental momentum again. So when we make a mistake, the more that it really comes down to the flow state activator and the alter ego. The more that they're aware of when they're making a mistake, what type of mentality they're in, what type of thinking they're in, and the more that's trained into them, the more they're able to see what state of mind they're in. Because if they have an awareness of what state of mind they're in, if it's the limited self or the empowering self, what that then happens is if they're aware of that, they can then choose the action that follows off the back of that based on those two versions of themselves. So if they're frustrated and they're realizing they're frustrated, they can go, oh shit, I'm in this person, which is their limited version of themselves. And they know that that person takes X actions, which might be dome their shell, hide, faking injury, do certain things, right? Or they can catch themselves, have an awareness, and they've got their empowering self, their alter ego name, they name it, they see it there, and they can pick an action that flows off the back of that, which typically is their cues, their flow state activated cues. Yeah. So in order to regain physical momentum in a performance, so meaning like to make a play, to get back into performance, they need to have mental momentum. So the first thing that we want to do is when we make a mistake, it's just the recognition of the mistake. An easy one for people to realize is the three A's. You need to have awareness that you're frustrated. You need to have acceptance that you're frustrated or that you made a mistake, and then you just need to be in action. But what ends up happening is if we don't deal with the mistake emotionally, if you get frustrated, that is, if you make a mistake and become frustrated, what tends to happen is if you go straight into action again, sometimes that can't be effective because that action is a representation of frustration and then you make more mistakes. So what we want to do is if we can down-regulate the nervous system and we can control the mind, accept it emotionally, what tends to happen is the action that's taken following is higher quality because the emotional side of ourselves has been controlled before taking action.
All right, I think I've got that. One of the big things I guess I've seen is helping players think for themselves. Obviously, I work with a younger clientele, and you've got the parent, you've got the rep coach, you've got the club coach, you've got the teacher, you've got me, all trying to tell them something else. How can we sort of go about helping people think for themselves and trying to get them to fit into the game plan a little bit more?
The first thing is to instill belief and confidence and a sense of belonging in them, in the environment and in the culture they're in, so they actually have the confidence and the belief to be able to think for themselves. So if they're in an environment and culture that they don't feel completely safe in, they're not going to think for themselves. They will just think within the box because they will fear by making a mistake or doing something outside of the scope will get them into trouble, get them dropped from the team, etc., etc. So the first thing is, in order to get someone to think for themselves, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, which is a psychologist that came up with a human needs, at the top of it is self-actualization, but at the bottom is you have to make like food and water, and you need basic needs, right? Someone who doesn't have food and water can't self-actualize their potential because their basic needs aren't being met. I think it's the second one from the bottom is like sense of belonging. If that person doesn't feel culturally connected and feel a sense of belonging in their environment they're in, how do we expect them to think for themselves? They're just going to told what to do and become robotic based on the instructions because they don't want to get in trouble or they don't want to make a mistake. So the first thing is to build a sense of belonging and make them feel seen and heard and accepted for who they are. And such by doing that, you give them confidence. The more tangible piece as well is don't overcomplicate things for them. Allow room for rigidity in adapting from the athlete's perspective. If you give them 10 things to focus on, do you think they're going to try and store the 11th in there somewhere? Where are they going to store that information? They've got 10 focus points you've given them. So keep it simple, and then that allows them the space in the mind to then see things in a performance. If they're cluttered in their mind, their ability to step back, get a broader snapshot of the performance and recognize that that person's carrying a calf injury, they're going to be slower off the mark, I'm going to attack that side of the field. They're not going to be able to do that if they've expected to withhold 15 pieces of information. So the clearer and the simpler you make it for them, the more they're going to adapt and fall into their own version of greatness. But emotionally, to get that natural expression for someone to think and act upon themselves, they have to feel safe enough in the environment to do so.
What I got from that was two things. One, simplicity. It just allows them to be themselves, don't overcomplicate it. And the two was being themselves in the culture. I feel like culture is very much a buzzword in, building culture and this and that. Do you have any, I guess, strategies or ways that help build an effective culture and an effective environment?
Yeah, so I just did a little bit of research into Sir Alex Ferguson, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was more than 23 years. But I think it was the research I looked at was from the point of when they called it the EPL, like the English Premier League. I think before that was called like First Division or something. But it was something like in these 23 years that he was coached from the EPL, I think it was from like 1993, it changed over names till when he retired as manager. He never finished outside the top three. Since then, I think in about 11 years, I think I counted they're on their 7th manager.
Something like that.
They're sitting 13th now. Well, this is the 15th of January, and that was about 3 days ago. So from the point of this podcast, I think they finished 8th last season, and I don't think they've won ever since. And so there's so many variables. And I listened to a podcast, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was like the simplest things got forgotten. Going off topic here slightly, I think the teams that aren't in sports like that where funding is massive, in NRL you've got like salary caps and whatnot, and different clubs have different money. And without going into that conversation, that's a can of worms. But like in the EPL, if you look at like Manchester City, like we know how much money they have in comparison to like Nottingham Forest or whatever. And I was talking to a guy, a professional footballer, just retired recently, played for the Socceroos. We were talking about the unfair advantage that the less funded teams have is that they have to be more resourceful with their culture. And by becoming more resourceful, you realize by doing things for free or simple that are easy, they actually are the things that build the culture. E.g., the All Blacks, one of the main things the All Blacks are known for is sweeping the sheds after a performance. That's free. But it built culture, or part of their culture. It was a standard of their culture, and a standard of the culture over time builds the culture. If you look at Melbourne Storm, the first time you join Melbourne Storm, you have to do work experience or work. That's free. Didn't cost the club money, well, unless I think it was volunteer work, so those businesses would have been loving it. Or if you looked at Sir Alex Ferguson, it's not the football strategy, I doubt. I doubt it's the formation strategy. There's something that Sir Alex Ferguson did on a daily basis that was seen as so small, but actually was so significant. And so one of the beliefs I have around culture is doing more informal things actually creates formality. So meaning like doing something away from the training paddock, like a hike as a team, and doing something like going up to a cafe or having a certain conversation. It's like sometimes it's the most informal things that have the most formal impact. Like sometimes it's not all about being in the environment of professional all the time. Sometimes the most less professional environments actually create the most impact. Or maybe it is, making a breakfast and, you have a roster system where every player cooks, every 2 or 3 groups of players cook breakfast every day. Like, yeah, it's a funny concept, culture, and there's so many ways you could go about it. But yeah, I see building culture as people very, very small standards that they're so easy to forget about and not do. But if you zoom out and you look over a broad perspective, I reckon it's the smallest things that Sir Alex Ferguson did over a 30-year period that got him those results.
It's a very key message that keeps coming back is simplicity. I see everything that we've talked about that. It's the simple things, it's the free things that help. You talk about mindset before and it was like how just keeping it simple. You did reference the All Blacks there. Obviously, they're known for their culture. Have you done a bit of research? Is there anything that stands out for you that they did that was just, goes above and beyond?
Not like massively. I know some of the, I've read the books and researched the people that have worked from a mental performance perspective in those environments. I think the All Blacks, from what I have seen, and only speaking from the outside looking in, actually wear their heart on their sleeve. They feel the ancestors, they feel the tribe, they feel. It's like the Indigenous round, the Maori versus All Stars, right? There's an element of, there's a spirituality to it. And I think that is there for the All Blacks. Like, I think there's a spirituality to it. There's so much heritage in that jersey. There's so much DNA. There's so much blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into that jersey that I think they really honor. And then also, I just think they are so competitive at their own standards that they've become so driven by meeting their own standards that it's just built that culture over time. And I don't think it was an overnight experience. I definitely would have been an overnight experience. But yeah, I think there's a level of humbleness that was either trained into them or that they've had carried through. But yeah, I think there's just a deep spiritual connection to the jersey. And I don't think that can be something that can be communicated. I think that's very hard to communicate and put into words. I think it's more of a felt experience.
In your experience, talking about culture, I know junior is probably a little bit more than a senior, but like social hierarchy, you got your alphas and sort of they control the room. And how do you sort of go about, I guess, eliminating that and trying to build a bit of more of a team experience rather than having queen bees and the alphas and people who are like top of the packs? Or do you want
I
those?
think
I
think alphas are healthy as long as it comes back to the common goal and the value set of the team. I think every team's gonna have their alpha. Michael Jordan was the alpha, right? So like, I think your alphas are just another word for greats. I think your alphas are just another word for the athletes that dare to be great because they have that aura about them. As long as it doesn't become into an egotistical battle and then we go away from the value set of the team, the standards of the team, the actions that correlate with those values, as long as those are being met, I think the alpha is a very valuable role inside the organization. As long as the club first, team first is always at the top of mind.
As long as like they know what the standards are and they're abiding by them.
They're not going to be known as the alpha if they're not also fulfilling the standard. I think you only become the alpha or you become an impactful alpha if you actually, it's monkey see, monkey do. Like, I actually think you only earn the respect of the alpha if you actually do the dirty work and you do the things you're expecting of others.
Do you get common misconceptions working in your industry, or is there a common misconception that you always see that pops up and you're like,
That such by doing mindset work, you will never be frustrated again. Like, the duality of life is birth and death, boy and girl, good and bad, rain and sun. A lot of people, when they start mindset work, they think it's about removing all negative self-talk altogether, or removing all anxiety altogether, or removing all of this altogether. It's not about that because it's a part of our human nature. It's there, right? And so the denial of those things only make them worse. I'm not removing these things, and if I said I was, I would be lying, and I wouldn't be true to who we are as humans and the way that we are. I just equip athletes with the ways to better deal with it and do our very best to make sure that when we're in those mindsets, it doesn't leak into the actions that we take in our performances.
what I'd like to do is get some, we have covered heaps of specific examples, but if I could break it down. So an activity pre-game that could be helpful for mindfulness, and then go pre, post, reflect?
So pre-performance, like the way that I help athletes is like they activate their alter ego, so they activate their best version of themselves, the characteristics, the actions that person that would take. They drop into the feelings of the alter ego. Okay, so this is the process that they do. They drop into the feelings of the alter ego. There's a story, there's a meaning behind it that we go through when we design the alter ego. So they sit with the best version of themselves. So someone listening can just like activate the best version of themselves through memory, through, you know, past performances when they felt really, really good, right? As an example. When they activate that and they get into that state, I then help the athlete just focus on their cues, their flow state activator points. And what that does is it really brings it back to their control. It really removes any anxieties, it removes any clutter, and it just brings it back to like, these are my 2 cues. If I do that, everything will flow from there. All momentum will flow from this place. And the more I just iterate the same principles, the more it's done, the reps are done, and the more it puts them into motion. So yeah, I just get them to activate their alter ego and then fall straight into their flow state activated cues that work for them. And then, you know, they're done into their performances very, very centrically focused on those performance cues.
So those cues would be what they focus on during the game as well. That's pre and
so they
during.
Can focus on that pre. If they're feeling a little bit anxious, for example, in the sheds before, anxiousness is also a way of us trying to predict a future that hasn't happened yet, trying to tell ourselves stories in our head, right? And so the way to do that and the way to mitigate that is to come back to what's inside of our control. And if they come back to their cue points, their flow state activator points, if every time they come back to that, they realize that it always worked for them. And they always gain momentum by focusing on them. And it always comes back to simplicity, and they come back to what's inside their control, and they're feeling more empowered. And so focusing on that before the performance, because most athletes will say once they cross that line, once that first tackle's been made, it's all sweet. It's the build-up. Half the time it's not losing your mind in the sheds before the game. Half the time it's not becoming like wasting mental energy, wasting vital energy in the sheds because you're in your mind all over the place scattered before the performance, getting yourself up for the performance, right? So more often than not, it's just about keeping calm and focus in the sheds or in, you know, whatever the environment is before the game.
Yeah. Would you change them for the game time strategies then? Would still be the same, still be the cues, still be the alter ego? What about post-game bit of reflection?
Yeah, so in the game, just to like touch on that quickly, it's like the cues aren't to say and nothing else can be focused on. The cues act as a way to actually focus on more. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Because you're just responding to the moment because you're clear and calm in the head. So that's why the cues are always great to focus on in performance, because it's just keeping the mind decluttered.
Would it be like one in defense, one in attack, for example, or it doesn't have to necessarily be either way for the cues?
Ideally, that's how I like to work, is 1 and 1, purely because then it becomes 2 focus points for D. And then before you know it, you're starting to add a third, and then clutter. You know, it's if you keep boundaries around it, it just keeps it stays really, really simple. Mm-hmm. You might even, depending on what sport you're in, you might have a transitional cue as well. So you might have a transitional cue, a D cue, and an attacking cue. And such, by doing that, you've got like the 3 main areas of, say, a rugby league game covered. You know, because you've got transitional work, obviously, defensive work, attacking work. Yeah. Post performance, one of the things I like to do is, if an athlete has activated their alter egos, what I'm really focusing on this season is helping them deactivate their alter ego. And the way they deactivate their alter ego, they deactivate themselves and tap into their human side of themselves, so they connect back with, you know, the version of themselves away from the sport, the father, the son, the partner, the mother, the daughter, whatever it may be, is just to find some quiet space, take a couple of deep breaths, and just ask yourself, what's the first thing I need to do as a human leaving here? And it just makes the transition out of the performer. So, you know, what we're doing is we're just, you know, we're not always just taking it home with us. Not that that's a bad thing, but particularly when we're acting the alter ego, it can be quite aggressive, and we can borderline be redhead with it. And so we don't want to take that alter ego home to your kids, right? We want to transition into you being a father or a mother. So, you know, finding some space on the way home or in the sheds or whatever after a game to be able to take a couple of deep breaths and even going through a simple gratitude process or a simple like, what do I need to do as a human leaving here? It just helps the transition out of, the performer version of yourself and into the human version of yourself.
I have some fan mail. It's the first time we've ever had fan mail, but obviously working with some coaches, I said you were coming on. I had a few questions, so if you don't mind. One of them was I had to Google what this word meant. So how can coaches better integrate their polyvagal theory into their everyday coaching strategies?
Yep.
Do you want to answer that one first and we'll move forward?
So, like, just to keep things like super, super simple, yeah, we've got our autonomic nervous system, we've got our parasympathetic nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so when we looked at sympathetic nervous system, I like activating the sympathetic nervous system under controlled environments, right? So what our sympathetic nervous system is we want to have that, we want to have intent, focus, aggression, that hunger for things. We want to have that, right? And so when we activate the alter ego advantage, like I was saying before, to a degree, they're activating a part of the sympathetic nervous system, but they're activating it with control. Okay, so they're activating that inner dog in them, that inner whatever in them, okay, because they want to win. They're about to go into war, right? You can't be too placid because then you're not going to go after the performance. So, like, I liked activating the sympathetic nervous system under control. And then you've got the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and restore. So if you look at it, you've got like blue head and red head, right? And then you've got like purple head in the middle, that beautiful balance between the two. Like, what was the question again, sorry?
How can the coaches better integrate it into their everyday coaching strategy?
I'm a massive believer that psychology informs physiology. So meaning, I was speaking to a head of performance at a club last year and we're talking about, say, respiratory rate. If a mind is overwhelmed, anxious and cluttered, respiratory rate is going to follow that. Okay? So if we can create barriers and cues in the mind to keep the mind under control, naturally the nervous system is going to be in a better environment. Because then our response to an error, if we psychologically overcome it, then our nervous system can respond to it. Obviously, we got our fight, flight, freeze responses, and inside the alter ego process, I help athletes unpack that for themselves. The fight, flight, freeze response, the way I like to work with it is just helping the athlete identify which one they fall into, and when did they, what was their past experiences, and when was that ignited? So was it childhood? Was it whatever? When was it getting a little bit deep here? Did they witness their mum and dad having arguments when they were younger and went into their room and hid? So maybe it's a flee response or a flight response. You know what I mean? So helping them identify where they created these responses from, and then again falling into the alter ego advantage process, they're able to recognize, my my freeze response is quote unquote the name of my limited self, and they're able to have that cue to trigger the awareness, if that makes sense, to help them in that moment. But yeah, coming back to answer the question really simply, it's like, just like, again, come back to simplicity, like create cues and structures around the mind. And if you just control the clutter of the mind and you create practicality and tangibility in what you're cueing these athletes, their physiology is going to naturally respond to the state of their psychology.
Okay, so that sort of goes into the next one of like some practical strategies to get athletes to return to that baseline when high pressure situation, everything's going on, you're trying to have that halftime talk and everyone's still elevated. Like, how can you sort of work around that?
Yeah, like in the moment, ideally if you can take a breath, then great, right? Obviously that's ideal, but that's not always going to happen. At halftime, as a coach, I think it's a very good thing to do is like have your first point of action with your playing group or someone in your team or the coaching staff. Everyone take 2 or 3 deep breaths just to down regulate the environment, put people back into a little bit more of a parasympathetic state. So when you do deliver the message you need to deliver, the absorption rate of the information is increased. If we don't do that, sometimes the message can go over our head because people are still in that frantic state of mind and they're not absorbing the information that the coach is trying to deliver to them at halftime because they're still in the mistake they made 20 minutes earlier. So by helping athletes down-regulate when they get into the sheds or get into the halftime environment at halftime, if they down-regulate with a couple of key breaths, that's going to help the absorption of the information from the coach be a lot more well-received.
And then before we go, is there anything that you'd want to say or anything cover that I haven't asked the right questions to that you want to share?
No, I think like ultimately every decision that we make, whether we believe it or not or understand it in the moment or not, comes from the mind. And so every action is a byproduct of thought. So thought is mind. And so the more that athletes are able to take the thought seriously, the mind, and able to train the mind no different to the body, the more they're going to take to optimize. Because you can train and you can train and you can train and you can train. But if the mind isn't up to the standard of the person to take the action that you want to take, you'll be held back. And so training the mind, hopefully I see over the next couple of years to come becomes just as important as training the skills in the physical body.
Honestly, thank you for your time. I've been following you for a while and I love everything you're doing. And I think a lot of what you said, I really resonate with because I'm trying into that mindset space and you talk about, especially that alter ego and it's creating that identity. And I think that's important for people in their everyday life if you want to level up and be someone else, and you need to create the identity that you want to move into. And that's sort of similar to creating that alter ego. So I appreciate your time and thank you for your chat. Before you leave, what is your superpower? What do you think your strengths are in life?
I was talking to family members the other day. We love going around the table and like having these conversations. I think my superpower is I love helping people activate and take action on the little voice within their head that tells them to do something, but they haven't had the confidence to do so. So whether it's more meaning in their life, whether it's a conversation with the parent they haven't had, whatever it may be, is like I feel like I really help someone really gain confidence to take action on that little voice that hasn't gone away for months, years, weeks, whatever it may be, whatever timeline, decades. And I feel like I help people believe in themselves to take action on whatever that little voice is telling them to say.
It's a good power to have. Where can people find you?
A lot of my focus is on Instagram. So Jared Brown with 2 N's at the end. So JARRED Brown BROWNN. Also on my podcast, the Elevated Athlete podcast. Able to, and very grateful I'm able to interview a lot of great athletes and will continue to hopefully do so. And so there's some pretty cool conversations over there.
For sure. Thank you.
Thank you, bro.
Cheers.